The Story of Civilization, Volume 5, The Renaissance, Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued. Cassette 11, Side 2. It is easier to rule a state in its decline than in its youth. Diminished vitality almost welcomes subjugation. Florence, beaten down again by the Medici in 1530, submitted wearily to domination by Clement VII. It rejoiced when the coarse tyrant Alessandro de' Medici was slain by his remote relative Lorenzino in 1537. And instead of seizing the opportunity to re-establish the Republic, it accepted a second Cosimo in hopes that he might show the wisdom and statesmanship of the first. The direct line of Cosimo Pater Patriae was now legally extinct. The younger Cosimo was descended from his older namesake's brother Lorenzo, 1395 to 1440. Guicciardini maneuvered the new ruler, then 18, into lordship in the hope of being the power behind the throne. But he forgot that the young Medici was the son of Giovanni delle Bande Nere and the grandson of Caterina Sforza, and therefore had at least 2 generations of iron in his blood. Cosimo took the reins in his own hands and held them firmly for 27 years. His character and government mingled evil and good. He was as severe and cruel as unsentimental policy might dictate. He did not bother, like earlier Medici, to maintain republican forms and facade. He arranged a system of espionage that entered every family and used parish priests as spies. He enforced unanimity of professed religious belief and cooperated with the Inquisition. He was greedy of wealth and power, exploited the state monopoly of grain, taxed his subjects avidly, overthrew the semi-republic of Siena to make that city, like Arezzo and Pisa, part of his dominions, and persuaded Pope Pius V to give him the title of Grand Duke of Tuscany, this in 1569. In partial compensation for the absolutism of his rule, he organized efficient administration, a reliable army and police, a competent and incorruptible judiciary. He lived simply, avoided costly ceremony and display, managed finances stringently, and left a full treasury to his son and heir. The order and safety that were now maintained on streets and highways revived the commerce and industry that had ailed under repeated revolutions. Cosimo brought in new manufacturers, as of coral and glass. He invited and protected Portuguese Jews as a stimulus to industrial development. He enlarged Livorno, or Leghorn, as a busy port. He had the marshes of the Maremma drained in an effort to free that region, and nearby Siena, from malaria. Under his conscientious despotism, Siena, like Florence, became more prosperous than ever before. He used part of his levied wealth to support literature and art without extravagance and with discrimination. He raised the Accademia degli Umidi to an official position as the Accademia Fiorentina, and commissioned it to set norms for proper Tuscan usage. He befriended Vasari and Cellini, tried hard to win Michelangelo back to Florence, and founded, under his absent presidency, an Arte del Disegno, or Academy of Design. He established at Pisa in 1544 a school of botany second only to Padua's in age and excellence. Doubtless Cosimo would have argued that he could not have accomplished this good had he not begun with a little evil and an iron fist. At 45, this Iron Duke was already worn out with the strains of power and family tragedies. Within a few months, in 1562, his wife and 2 of his sons died from malarial fever caught during his efforts to drain the Maremma swamps. A year later, he lost a daughter. In 1564, he resigned the actual government to his son Francesco. He tried to console himself with amours, but found more boredom in promiscuity than in marriage. He died in 1574, aged 55. He had lived up to the best and the worst in his ancestry. Though Florence no longer produced Leonardos or Michelangelos, and had no artists to compare in this period with the urbane and universal Titian, the volcanic Tintoretto, or the festal Veronese, she experienced under her second Cosimo as vigorous a revival as could be expected from a generation that had grown up amid frustrated revolt and unsuccessful war. Even so, Cellini judged the artists employed by Cosimo to be a band the like of which is not to be found at present in the world, which is a typically Florentine understatement of Venetian art. Benvenuto thought the Duke a patron with more taste than generosity, but perhaps this able governor considered economic reconstruction and political order more vital than the artistic decoration of his court. Vasari described Cosimo as loving and favoring all artists, and indeed all men of genius. It was Cosimo who financed at Chiusi Arezzo and elsewhere, the excavations that revealed a remarkable Etruscan culture, and unearthed the famous Etruscan bronze statues of the Chimera, the Orator, and Minerva. He brought back as many as he could locate of the art treasures looted from the Medici Palace in 1494 and 1527, added his own collections to them, and housed the total in that palace fortress that Luca Pitti had begun 100 years before. Cosimo had this monstrous edifice enlarged by Bartolomeo Ammannati and made it his official dwelling in 1553. Ammannati and Vasari were in Florence the leading architects of the age. It was Ammannati who laid out for Cosimo the famous Boboli Gardens behind the Pitti Palace and spanned the Arno with the beautiful Santa Trinita Bridge from 1567 to 1570, destroyed in the Second World War. He was also a painter and sculptor of quality. He won sculptural competitions from Cellini and Giovanni da Bologna and carved the Juno that adorns the Bargello court. In his old age, he apologized for having made many pagan figures. The pagan Renaissance had now, in 1560, run its course, and Christianity was regaining its hold on the Italian mind. Cosimo made Baccio Bandinelli his favorite sculptor, to the horror of Cellini. One of Cosimo's recreations was in hearing Cellini berate Bandinelli. Baccio was popular with himself. He proclaimed his intention to surpass Michelangelo and was so critical of other artists that one of the gentlest, Andrea Sansovino, tried to kill him. Nearly everybody hated him, but his many commissions in Florence and Rome suggest that his talent was better than his character. When Leo X wished to duplicate the complex Laocoon group of the Belvedere as a gift to Francis I, Cardinal Bibbiena asked Bandinelli to undertake the assignment. Baccio promised to make a copy superior to the original. To the general dismay, he almost succeeded. Clement VII was so pleased with the result that he sent authentic antiques to Francis and kept Baccio's copy for the Medici Palace in Florence, whence it passed to the Uffizi Gallery. For Clement and Alessandro de' Medici, Bandinelli carved a gigantic group, Hercules and Cacus, which was set up on the porch of the Palazzo Vecchio beside Michelangelo's David. Cellini did not like it. If your Hercules had his hair cropped, he told Bandinelli in Cosimo's presence, he would not have skull enough to hold his brains. His heavy shoulders remind one of the two baskets of a donkey's pack saddle. His chest and muscles are copied not from nature, but from a bag of bad melons. Clement, however, thought the Hercules a masterpiece and rewarded the sculptor with a substantial property in addition to the promised fee. Baccio repaid the compliment by giving the name Clement to a bastard born to him soon after the Pope's death. His last work was a tomb prepared by him for himself and his father. As soon as it was finished, he occupied it. In 1560. Probably he would have greater renown today had he not been invidiously immortalized by two artists who could write as well as design, Vasari and Cellini. Giovanni da Bologna was a more genial competitor. Born at Douai, he made his way in youth to Rome in 1561, resolved to be a sculptor. After a year of study there, he brought a clay sample of his work to the aged Michelangelo. The old sculptor took it in his hands, pressed it here and there with his worn fingers and heavy thumbs, and in a few moments molded it to greater significance. Giovanni never forgot that visit. Throughout the remainder of his 84 years, he labored with unrelaxing ambition to equal the Titan. He started back to Flanders, but a Florentine nobleman advised him to study the art collected in Florence, and for 3 years maintained him in his palace. There were so many Italian artists in or near the city that it took the Fleming 5 years to win acceptance for his work. Then Francesco, son of Duke Cosimo, bought his Venus. He entered a competition to design a fountain for the Piazza della Signoria. Cosimo judged him too young for so responsible an assignment, but his model was rated best by many artists, and probably it won him an invitation to build a much larger fountain in Bologna. After that, Giovanni was brought back to Florence as official sculptor for the Medici, and never lacked commissions. When he went to Rome again, Vasari introduced him to the Pope as the Prince of the Sculptors of Florence. In 1583 he modeled a group, now in the Loggia dei Lanzi, and named an afterthought the Rape of the Sabines. A hero, virile and muscular, holds in his grasp a ravishing woman whose soft form is realistically compressed against his supporting hand, and whose back is the loveliest in the bronze sculpture of the Renaissance. The sculptors surpassed the painters in Cosimo's galaxy and regard. Ridolfo Ghirlandaio strove but failed to maintain his father's excellence. We may sample him from his portrait of Lucrezia su Maria in Washington. Francesco Ubertini, nicknamed Il Bacchiacca, liked to paint historical scenes in great detail on a small scale. Jacopo Carucci, called Pontormo from his birthplace, had every advantage and a good start. He received instruction from Leonardo, Piero di Cosimo, and Andrea del Sarto. And at 19 in 1513 he stirred the art world with a painting, now lost, that aroused the admiration of Michelangelo and was pronounced by Vasari the finest fresco ever seen till then. But soon afterward, to the disgust of the Italians, Pontormo fell in love with the engravings of Dürer, abandoned the smooth lines and harmonies of the Italian style, preferred crude and heavy Germanic forms, and pictured men and women in poses of physical or mental disturbance. In frescoes at the Certosa outside Florence, Pontormo painted in this Teutonic style scenes from the Passion of Christ. Vasari resented this imitation. Was not Pontormo aware that Germans and Flemings come to learn the Italian style, which he made such an effort to shake off as if it were bad? Even so, Vasari confessed the power of these frescoes. Pontormo further complicated his art by developing phobias. He never allowed death to be mentioned in his presence. He avoided feasts and crowds, lest he be crushed to death. Though himself kind and gentle, he distrusted nearly everyone except his beloved pupil Bronzino. More and more he courted solitude until he formed the habit of sleeping in an upper-story room reachable only by a ladder which he pulled up after him. On his final assignment, to fresco the main chapel of San Lorenzo, he worked for 11 years in isolation, boarding up the chapel and allowing none but himself to enter. He died in 1556 before finishing the task. And when the frescoes were unveiled, it was seen that the figures were badly disproportioned, the faces excited or melancholy. Let us remember him by a work of his saner maturity, the lovely portrait of Ugolino Martelli, now in Washington. Soft feathered hat, pensive eyes, luminous raiment, immaculate hands. Agnolo di Cosimo di Mariano, named Bronzino, distinguished himself by a remarkable series of portraits, chiefly of the Medici. The Medici Palace contains a gallery of them, from Cosimo Pater Patriae to Duke Cosimo, and if we may judge from the pouchy face of his Leo X, they were often truthful. The best of them is of Giovanni della Bandinere in the Uffizi, a veritable Napoleon before Bonaparte, handsome, proud, and breathing fire. Probably Duke Cosimo's favorite artist was the man to whom this and every book on the Italian Renaissance owes half its life, Giorgio Vasari. The family into which he was born at Arezzo already included several artists. He was distantly related to Luca Signorelli, and he has told us how the old painter, seeing Giorgio's boyhood drawings, encouraged him in studying design. In one of those innumerable acts of magnanimous and clairvoyant patronage that should be considered in judging the morals of the Renaissance, Cardinal Passerini, who had been appointed guardian of Ippolito and Alessandro de' Medici, took Giorgio to Florence, and there the lad of 12 shared the studies of the young heirs to wealth and power. He became a pupil of Andrea del Sarto and Michelangelo, and to the end of his life he revered Buonarroti, broken nose and all, as a god. When the Medici were expelled from Florence in 1527, Giorgio returned to Arezzo. At 18, his father having died of plague, he found himself the chief support of his 3 sisters and 2 young brothers. Again kindness rescued him. His former fellow pupil, Ippolito de' Medici, invited him to Rome, where for 3 years Vasari sedulously studied ancient and Renaissance art. And in 1530 Alessandro, master of Florence after another restoration, called him to live and paint in the Palazzo Medici. There he made portraits of the family, including Lorenzo the Magnificent in a somber study, and the vivacious young Caterina, posing and opposing at whim, as if already conscious that she would be Queen of France. When Alessandro was assassinated, Vasari wandered for some time patronless. His paintings are rudely dealt with by modern critics, but they must have earned him some repute, for at Mantua he was housed by Giulio Romano, and at Venice Aretino was his burly chaperone. Wherever he went, he carefully studied the local art, talked with artists or their descendants, collected drawings, and made notes. Back in Rome, he painted for Bindo Altoviti a deposition from the cross, which, he tells us, had the good fortune not to displease the greatest sculptor, painter, and architect that ever lived in our time. It was this Michelangelo who introduced him to the second Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, and it was this cultivated prelate who, in 1546, suggested to Vasari that he should compose for the guidance of posterity the lives of the artists who had so distinguished the Italy of the preceding 200 years. While busily serving as painter and architect in Rome, Rimini, Ravenna, Arezzo, and Florence, Giorgio devoted part of his time to the unremunerative labor of the lives, moved by love for these our artists. In 1550 he published the first edition of these Vitae dei più eccellenti pittori, scultori ed architetti italiani, with an eloquent dedication to Duke Cosimo. From 1555 to 1572 he was Cosimo's chief artist. He remodeled the interior of the Palazzo Vecchio and decorated many of its walls with paintings more immense than magnificent. He raised the vast administration building known from its governmental offices as the Uffizi, and now one of the great art galleries of the world. He led in completing the Laurentian Library and constructed the enclosed corridor that enabled Cosimo to pass under cover from the Palazzo Vecchio and the Uffizi across the Ponte Vecchio to the new ducal residence in the Pitti Palace. In 1567 he spent several months in travel and research, and a year later he brought out a new and much enlarged edition of the Lives. He died in Florence in 1574 and was buried with his ancestors in Arezzo. He was not a great artist, but he was a good man, an industrious investigator, and, barring a few bites at Bandinelli, a generous as well as intelligent critic. In simple, racy, almost colloquial Tuscan, and occasionally with the vividness of the novelle, he gave us one of the most interesting books of all time, from which 1,000 other volumes have been cribbed. It is rich in inaccuracies, anachronisms, and contradictions, but richer still in fascinating information and judicious interpretation. It did for the artists of Renaissance Italy what Plutarch had done for the martial or civic heroes of Greece and Rome. It will remain for centuries to come one of the classics of the world's literature. 5. Benvenuto Cellini, 1500 to 1571. There was in this age at the court of Cosimo a man who united in his character all the violence and sensitivity, all the mad pursuit of beauty in life and art, all the exhilarating pride of health, skill, or power that distinguished the Renaissance, who, moreover, possessed the spontaneous capacity to pour forth his thoughts and feelings, vicissitudes and accomplishments, in one of the most engaging and unforgettable of all autobiographies. Benvenuto was not, no one man could be, completely typical of the Renaissance genius. He lacked the piety of Angelico, the craft of Machiavelli, the modesty of Castiglione, the blithe suavity of Raphael. And surely not all Italian artists of the time took the law into their own hands as Benvenuto did. Yet, as we read his turbulent narrative, we feel that his book, more than any other, more even than Vasari's Lives, takes us behind the scenes and into the heart of the Renaissance. He begins disarmingly. All men of whatsoever quality they be, who have done anything of excellence, or which may properly resemble excellence, ought, if they are persons of truth and honesty, to describe their life with their own hand. But they ought not to attempt so fine an enterprise till they have passed the age of 40. This duty occurs to my own mind, now that I am traveling beyond the term of 58 years, and am in Florence, the city of my birth. He is proud that he was born humble, and made his family famous. At the same time, he assures us that he was descended from a captain of Julius Caesar. In a work like this, he warns us, there will always be found occasion for natural bragging. He was called Benvenuto, welcome, because his parents expected a girl and were pleasantly surprised. His grandfather, probably violating all of Cornaro's precepts, lived 100 years. Cellini, inheriting his vitality, crowded as many into 71. His father was an engineer, a worker in ivory, and a devotee of the flute. His fond hope was that Benvenuto would become a professional flutist and play in the band at the Medici court. In later years he seems to have derived more pleasure from hearing that his son had become a flutist in Pope Clement's private orchestra than from the goldsmithery by which the youth was earning florins and fame. But Benvenuto was enamored of beautiful forms rather than of melodious sounds. He saw some of the work of Michelangelo and caught the fever of art. He studied the cartoon for the Battle of Pisa and was so impressed by it that even the Sistine Chapel ceiling seemed to him less marvelous. Against his father's pleading, he apprenticed himself to a goldsmith, but in filial compromise he continued to practice the hated flute. In Filippino Lippi's house he found a book of drawings representing the art antiquities of Rome. He burned with desire to see those renowned exemplars with his own eyes, and often he talked with his friends about going to the capital. One day he and a young woodcarver, Giambattista Tasso, walking aimlessly and talking passionately, found themselves at the gate of San Piero Gattolini. Benvenuto remarked that he felt himself already halfway from Florence to Rome. On a mutual dare, they walked on, mile after mile, until they reached Siena, 33 miles away. There, John's feet rebelled. Cellini had money enough to hire a horse. The two youths rode the one animal, and, singing and laughing, we traveled the whole way to Rome. I had just 19 years then, and so had the century. In Rome he found work as a goldsmith, studied the ancient remains, and earned enough to send his father consolatory sums. But the doting father pled so earnestly for his return that after 2 years Benvenuto went back to Florence. He had hardly domiciled himself there when he stabbed a youth in a quarrel. Thinking he had killed him, he fled again to Rome in 1521. He pored over Michelangelo's paintings in the Sistine Chapel, Raphael's in the Villa Chigi, and the Vatican. He noted all interesting forms and lines in men and women, metals and foliage. Soon he was the best goldsmith in Rome. Clement took to him first as a flutist, then discovered his excellence in design. Cellini made such handsome coins for him that the Pope appointed him stamp master of the papal mint, that is, designer of currency for the papal states. Each cardinal had a seal, sometimes as large as the head of a 12-year-old child, which was used to impress the wax that sealed a letter. Some such seals were worth 100 crowns, or about $1,250. Cellini engraved seals and coins, cut and set gems, modeled medallions, enameled cameos, made 100 varieties of objects in silver and gold. These various departments of art, he writes, are very different from one another, so that a man who excels in one of them, if he undertakes another, hardly ever achieves the same success. Whereas I strove with all my power to become equally versed in all of them, and in the proper place I shall demonstrate that I attained my object. Benvenuto brags on almost every page, but with such consistency and ardor that at last we come to believe him. He speaks of his fine physiognomy and bodily symmetry, and we cannot deny it. Nature bestowed on me a temperament so happy and of such excellent parts that I was freely able to accomplish whatever it pleased me to take in hand. Among these pleasant objects was a girl of great beauty and grace whom I used as a model. I used frequently to pass the night with her. After indulgence in sexual pleasure, my slumber is sometimes very deep. From one such slumber he woke to find himself host of the French disease. In 50 days he was cured, and took another mistress. We glimpse the lawlessness of Italian city life in the 16th century when we note with what easy conscience Cellini overrode the commandments of church and state. Apparently the policing of Rome was lax and fragmentary. A man of strong instincts could be, sometimes had to be, a law unto himself. When provoked, Benvenuto felt a fever which would have been my death had I not resolved to give it vent. When offended, I thought I ought to act as well as intone my misereres. He fell into 100 quarrels, and, he assures us, was in the right in all but one. He stuck a dagger into the neck of one offender, and with such matador precision that the man fell dead. In another case, I stabbed him just beneath the ear. I gave him only 2 blows, for he fell stone dead at the second. I had not meant to kill him, but, as the saying goes, knocks are not dealt out by measure. His theology was as independent as his morality. Since he was always right, but once, he felt that God must be on his side, giving more power to his arm. He prayed to God for aid in his murders, and gave him due credit for his success. However, when God failed to answer his prayers to help him find his lost love Angelica, he turned to devils for supplementary aid. A Sicilian sorcerer took him to the deserted Colosseum at night, drew a magic circle on the ground, lit a fire, sprinkled perfumes on the flames, and with Hebrew, Greek, and Latin invocations summoned demons to appear. Benvenuto was sure that hundreds of phantoms rose before him, and that they predicted his early reunion with Angelica. He returned to his house and spent the rest of the night seeing devils. When the imperial army sacked Rome, Cellini fled to the Castel Sant'Angelo and served as a gunner. It was one of his shots, he avers, that killed the Duke of Bourbon, and it was his expert marksmanship that kept the besiegers at a distance from the castle, so saving the Pope, the cardinals, and Benvenuto. We do not know how true this is, but we have it on the same authority that when Clement returned to Rome, he made Cellini a mace-bearer with a salary of 200 crowns, or about $2,500 a year, and said, Were I but a wealthy emperor, I would give Benvenuto as much land as my eyes could survey. Yet, being now but a needy bankrupt, I will at any rate give him bread enough to satisfy his need." Paul III continued Clement's patronage. Probably exaggerating to his heart's delight, Cellini quotes Paul as saying, to one who protested his lenience with the artist, "Know then that men like Benvenuto, unique in their profession, stand above the law, and how far more, then, he who received the provocation I have heard of." But Paul's son Pierluigi, as reckless a rascal as Benvenuto himself, turned the Pope against the artist. Even Cellini's arts proved inadequate to overcome such influence, and in 1537 he abandoned his shop in Rome and made for France. On the way he was handsomely entertained by Bembo at Padua, made a small portrait of him, and was in return presented with horses for himself and his two companions. They mounted and descended the Grison, and rode through Zurich, Lausanne, Geneva, and Lyon to Paris. There too Benvenuto found enemies. Giovanni de Rossi, Florentine painter, wanted no more rivals for the king's money. He put difficulties in the way of the newcomer, and when at last Cellini got to Francis, he found him inextricably tangled in war. Ill and homesick, he climbed back over the Alps, made a pilgrimage to Loreto, and crossed the Apennines to Rome. To his dismay, he found himself accused by Pierluigi of having embezzled papal jewelry. He was flung into the same castello that he had helped to save, and suffered months of imprisonment. He escaped, but broke a leg in the process. Captured, he was confined in an underground dungeon for 2 years. He was released at the request of Francis I, who now urgently solicited his services in France. Once more he clambered over the Alps in 1540. He found king and court at Fontano Bellio, that is, Fontainebleau, was warmly welcomed, and was assigned a castle in Paris for his workshop and home. When its occupants refused to leave, he expelled them by force. The French did not like his manners or his language, and Madame d'Etampes, the king's mistress, resented Cellini's lack of courtesy to her high estate. When she heard how he had thrown out of the castle windows the furniture of the tenants whom he had dispossessed, she warned Francis that devil will sack Paris one of these days. The merry monarch enjoyed the story, forgave Cellini's violence for his artistry, and paid him 700 crowns a year, or about $8,750, 500 more for the expenses of his trip from Rome, and promised an additional sum for each work of art that Cellini should produce for him. Benvenuto was proud to learn that these were the same terms that had been given to Leonardo 24 years before. One of the dispossessed tenants sued him in court on a charge of stealing some effects. The court decided against Cellini. He reversed the judgment in his own striking way. "When I perceived that my cause had been unjustly lost, I had recourse for my defense to a great dagger which I carried, for I have always taken pleasure in keeping fine weapons. The first man I attacked was the plaintiff who had sued me, and one evening I wounded him in the legs and arms so severely, taking care, however, not to kill him, that I deprived him of the use of both his legs." Apparently the plaintiff dared not press the matter further, and Cellini could turn his energies to other outlets. He had in his Paris studio a poor young girl, Caterina. I keep her principally for my art's sake, since I cannot do without a model, but being a man also, I have used her for my pleasure. However, Caterina, with yielding largesse, slept also with his helper, Pagolo Micheri. Benvenuto, learning of it, beat her till he was exhausted. His servant Roberta reproved him for punishing so violently so ordinary an incident. Did he not know that there's not a husband in France without horns? The next day he modeled from Caterina again, during which occurred some amorous diversions, and at last, on the same hour as on the previous day, she irritated me to such a pitch that I gave her the same drubbing. So we went on for several days, repeating the same round. Meanwhile, I completed my work in a style which did me the greatest credit. Another model, Jeanne, presented him with a daughter. He settled a dowry on the mother, and from that time I had nothing more to do with her. The child was later smothered by its nurse. Francis bore patiently with all this lawlessness, but finally Benvenuto had so many enemies in Paris that he begged the king's permission to visit Italy. Consent was not given, but Cellini took French leave, and, after an arduous trip, found himself in his native Florence in 1545. There he showed a better side of his nature, contributing materially to the support of his sister and her 6 daughters. He found Cosimo less open-handed than Francis. He made the usual enemies, but he cast a good portrait bust of the Duke, now in the Bargello, and produced for him his most celebrated work, the Perseus, that still stands in the Loggia dei Lanzi. He tells a vivid story of the casting. His anxieties, toil, and exposure to heat and cold culminated in a severe fever that compelled him to take to his bed just when the furnace that he had designed especially for this work was melting the metal, and this proved insufficient to fill the gigantic mold. The labor of months was about to be spoiled when Cellini rose from his bed and threw into the furnace a block of tin and 200 pewter vessels. These proved enough. The casting was a complete success, and when the work was exposed to public view in 1554, it was praised as highly as any statue made in Florence since Michelangelo's David. Even Bandinelli said a good word for it. From this climax, the story descends to prosaic pages of haggling with the Duke about the fee for the Perseus. Benvenuto was long on expectations, Cosimo was short of funds. The narrative abruptly ends at 1562. It does not mention the fact, otherwise fairly well established, that in 1556 Benvenuto was twice imprisoned, apparently on charges of criminal immorality. In these late years, Cellini composed a treatise on the goldsmith's art, Trattato dell'Oreficeria. Having sown wild oats for half a century, he married in 1564 and had 2 legitimate children to add to 1 illegitimate child begotten in France and 5 generated in Florence after his return. Of his works, usually small enough to be readily movable, only a few can now be located and identified. The Treasury of St. Peter's has an ornate silver candelabrum attributed to Cellini. The Bargello preserves his Narcissus and his Ganymede, both in marble and both excellent. The Pitti has a salver and a pitcher in silver. The Louvre has his fine medallion of Bembo and a lovely bronze relief called the Nymph of Fontainebleau. Vienna claims the salt cellar made for Francis I. The Gardner collection in Boston has his bust of Altoviti. His large crucifixion is in the Escorial. These scattered specimens hardly equip us to judge Cellini as an artist. They seem too slight for his fame, and even the Perseus, violent and overwrought, inclines to the Baroque. Yet Clement VII, we have it on Benvenuto's word, rated him as the greatest artist in his craft who was ever born. And an extant letter of Michelangelo to Cellini reads, "I have known you all these years as the greatest goldsmith of whom the world has ever heard." We may conclude that Cellini was a genius and a ruffian, a master craftsman and a murderer, whose spirited autobiography outshines his silver and golden cameos and reconciles us to the morals of our time. 6. Lesser Lights. This age of decline for Italy was a resurrection for Savoy. As a lad of 8, Emmanuel Philibert might have seen the French invade and conquer the duchy in 1536. At 25, he inherited its crown, but not its soil. At 29, he played a leading part in the victory of the Spanish and the English over the French at Saint-Quentin in 1557. And 2 years later, France surrendered to him his ruined country and bankrupt throne. His regeneration of Savoy and Piedmont was a masterpiece of statesmanship. The alpine slopes of his duchy were the haunts of Vaudois heretics, who were progressively transforming Catholic churches into whitewashed conventicles of Calvinist worship. Pope Pius IV offered him a year's ecclesiastical revenues to suppress the sect. Emmanuel took some drastic measures, but when these resulted in large-scale emigration, he turned to a policy of tolerance, checked the ardor of the Inquisition, and gave asylum to Huguenot refugees. He founded a new university at Turin and financed the compilation of an encyclopedia, Teatro Universale di tutte le scienze. He was always courteous and repeatedly unfaithful to his wife, Margaret of Valois, who gave him wise counsel and diplomatic aid, and who presided over the bright social and intellectual life of Turin. When Emmanuel died in 1580, his duchy was one of the best-governed lands in Europe. From his line in the 19th century would come the kings of United Italy. Meanwhile, Andrea Doria, who in the late wars had passed from the French to the Spanish side with timely treachery, maintained his leadership in Genoa. The bankers there had helped to finance the campaigns of Charles V, who repaid them by leaving undisturbed their domination of the city. Not as badly hurt as Venice by the movement of commerce out of the Mediterranean into the Atlantic, Genoa became again a great port and strategic citadel. Galeazzo Alessi of Perugia, a pupil of Michelangelo, built sumptuous churches and palaces in Genoa. Vasari described the Via Balbi as the most splendid street in Italy. When Francesco Maria Sforza, last of his line as rulers, died in 1535, Charles V appointed an imperial vicar to govern Milan. Subjection brought peace, and the ancient city prospered once more. Alessi built there the handsome Palazzo Marino, and Leone Leoni, engraver in the Milan Mint, rivaled Cellini in the miniature plastic arts, but found no Cellini to publish his excellence. The most distinguished Milanese of the age was San Carlo Borromeo, who reenacted at the close of the Renaissance the role played by St. Ambrose in the decline of antiquity. He came of a rich patrician family. His uncle, Pius IV, made him a cardinal at 21 and Archbishop of Milan at 22 in 1560. He was probably at that time the richest prelate in Christendom, but he renounced all his benefices except the archbishopric, gave the proceeds to charity, and consumed himself in almost fanatical devotion to the Church. He founded the Order of Oblates of St. Ambrose, brought the Jesuits into Milan, and vigorously supported all movements for ecclesiastical reform that remained loyal to Catholicism. Accustomed to wealth and power, he insisted on the full medieval jurisdiction of his episcopal court, took into his hands much of the work of maintaining law and order, filled his archiepiscopal dungeons with criminals and heretics, and for 24 years was the real ruler of the city. Literature and art suffered under his passion for conformity and morality, but Pellegrino Tibaldi, architect and painter, flourished under his patronage and designed the grandiose choir of the great cathedral. All the cardinal's severity was forgiven when, in the plague of 1576, while most notables fled, he stayed at his post and comforted the sick and bereaved with tireless visits, vigils, and prayers. At Cernobbio, on Lake Como, Cardinal Tolomeo Gallio, perhaps not sure of another heaven, built the Villa d'Este in 1568. At Brescia, Giambattista Moroni, pupil of Moretto, painted some portraits worthy to stand beside most of Titian's. In Cremona, Vincenzo Campi carried on the family tradition of painting less than immortal pictures. At Ferrara, Ercole II compromised the long quarrel of his state with the papacy by paying Paul III 180,000 ducats and pledging 7,000 ducats tribute per year. Alfonso II gave the city another era of prosperity from 1558 to 1597, which culminated in the Gerusalemme Liberata of Torquato Tasso and the Pastor Fido of Giovanni Guarini. Girolamo da Carpi learned the art of painting from Garofolo, but, Vasari says, spent too much time on love and the lute, and married too soon, to indulge himself in the self-centeredness of genius. Piacenza and Parma rose to excited prominence in this age. Though they had for centuries belonged to Milan, and that duchy was now a dependency of Charles V, Pope Paul III claimed the two cities as papal fiefs, and invested his son Pierluigi Farnese with them in 1545. Not quite 2 years later, the new duke was assassinated at Piacenza by a revolt of nobles reconciled to his lechery, but resenting his monopoly of power and plums. Paul rightly ascribed the initiative in the conspiracy to Ferrante Gonzaga, then ruling Milan as vicar for Charles, and noted that imperial troops, providentially at hand, at once took possession of Piacenza for the emperor, this in 1547. Soon after Paul's death, Julius III appointed Pierluigi's son Ottavio Duke of Parma, and as Ottavio was also Charles's son-in-law, he was allowed to rule Parma till his death in 1586. No decline was visible in Bologna. Here, Vignola designed the Portico dei Banchi for a group of traders. Antonio Morandi added to the university an archiginnasio famous for its noble cortile. And Sebastiano Serlio wrote an architectural treatise that rivaled Palladio's in influence. In 1563, Pope Pius IV commissioned Tommaso Laretti of Palermo to set up a fountain in the Piazza di San Petronio. The sculptural part of the undertaking was offered to a young Flemish artist, who now came from Florence and perhaps received his name from the city in which he produced his greatest work. Giovanni da Bologna, or John Bologna, molded 9 figures for the immense Fontana di Nettuno. At the summit of the group he raised a gigantic god of the waters, naked and strong. On the corners of the basin he cast in bronze 4 happy children in a game with leaping dolphins. At the feet of Neptune he placed 4 graceful maidens, squeezing streams of water from their breasts. Bologna sent John back to Florence with florins and praise, and did not grudge the 70,000 florins, or $875,000, that it had spent on the magnificent fountain. The spirit of civic art was still alive in Italy. As we take our parting look at Renaissance Rome, we are struck by the rapidity of her recovery from the disaster of 1527. Clement VII had shown more skill in remedying the ruin than in preventing it. His surrender to Charles had saved the Papal States, and their revenues helped the papacy to finance the restoration of church discipline and the partial reconstruction of Rome. The full effect of the Reformation in reduced income was not yet felt in the papal treasury, and under Paul III, the spirit and splendor of the Renaissance seemed for a moment revived. Some arts were dying, others were being born or changing form. This book is continued on Cassette 12, Side 1.